Hi friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Jerry. My channel is about helping people go through a difficult time, also about helping people find hope and purpose in the world that we live in today. I'm so excited to tell you about my experience with exposure therapy. First of all, I don't claim to be a therapist or have any professional experience in the industry. I am the patient. I actually did exposure therapy myself, and I want to tell you about my experience with it so you can decide if exposure therapy is going to be something that's going to be right for you. Because I do believe with exposure therapy, you have got to want to do exposure therapy. If somebody is trying to pressure you into doing exposure therapy, don't do it. You got to do it yourself and make that decision on your own. If you're forced into exposure therapy, it actually might traumatize you. But I do know a lot of people use exposure therapy to help with OCD. But I was using exposure therapy to just overcome a fear, a general fear that I had in my life. And when I say like a general fear, I'm saying people who have a fear of water, people who have a fear of heights or confined spaces or like claustrophobia. Maybe you have a fear of snakes. For me, I have a fear of loud, sudden sounds. Ever since I was little, I really struggled around fireworks. And as an adult, I didn't realize it was going to trickle over into being afraid of guns and balloons as well, or really any sharp, loud, sudden sound. And so when I say guns, like I'm not against guns. I'm all for the right to bear arms. But I'm saying because of the sound they make, they send an intense fear wave through my body. There was one point where I went to a bachelor party. The bachelor party didn't have enough guys to attend the gun range, so they invited all the girls to come from the bachelorette party. And I remember going, and it was a bachelor party for a police officer. So there were all these crazy, intense guns at the gun range. And I remember just standing there. I literally had earplugs in my ears and earmuffs on. I was holding this gun, and somebody else shot a gun, and I freaked out. I jolted back and I was like, okay, nope, this isn't for me. I started crying. I went outside and just played with the dog that was outside. I think it was because when I was little, my fairgrounds would always have cannons go off during the 4th of July. And I just remember being at the fairgrounds and one of the cannons went off. Maybe that, I don't even know if that's what it was, but I remembered this just sheer feeling of panic throughout my body. And ever since then, when I'm around loud, sudden sounds, I feel physical pain. And so there was a day I was at a kid's birthday party. Here's me as an adult in my 20s at the time. And I remember sitting at this birthday party and there was a little kid. He was just had this balloon in his hand. And he was anyway, I was like, that balloon's going to pop. That balloon's going to pop. Is playing with a balloon, or we have a family event and there's balloons around. Everybody knows my family to take the balloons outside if you're going to pop them because Auntie Jerry just can't handle it. And it's true. I have a really hard time with that stuff. I really wanted to try exposure therapy. And exposure therapy is the idea that as you expose yourself to this fear, your body goes into a state of fear and you're in a controlled environment, like somebody else is controlling it. And it's very important that you have somebody who is either trained in exposure therapy, a professional psychologist, or somebody who has worked with exposure therapy before. Because if you do exposure therapy, let's just say with a friend and you have a fear of dogs and that dog is on a leash or whatever, and you're approaching the dog, and if your friend pushes you, that could actually traumatize you in a much worse way. So that is why you have to be in a controlled environment with somebody else who's you trust, who is in control, which is best with a professional or somebody trained in it. And that way, you're in safety, even though your body is dysregulated in a state of fear. I went to this environment, and the person who was there was walking me through getting in front of a gun that was in a gun case and opening it up and holding a gun in my hand. And for me, that seems like it would be almost an impossible feat for me without being dysregulated and feeling a state of fear in my body. So I knew what I was walking into, and it's really important that you know what you're walking into, but that you are in a state of safety as well with somebody walking you through it. The person in front of me was like, okay, right behind me, there are 2 gun cases. What I'm going to have you do when you're ready is you walk over to them and you just stand in front of the gun cases. And for me, it was like that welling up feeling of fear. You know, if you have a fear of heights, it's like you approaching that bridge where, you know, if you look down, your body's going to go into that dysregulated state, but you're approaching the bridge, right? So that's where I was at this point, approaching the guns. And obviously they were not loaded, and I knew exactly what was happening before I was walking into it. So I walk up to these guns, and the next step that I took was opening the gun case and putting my hand on the gun. And what I became very aware of is the feeling of fear coming into my body, but then also the feeling intensifying in my body. Because normally, if I were to approach a firework or a balloon or a gun, I would flee. I would just go in the opposite direction. I would leave the room. But I was like, no, I will overcome this. Like, I'm going to work on this. That's where I started to actually feel the full intensity of fear in my body. And when that happened, I immediately just had tears streaming down my face. As I was going to open this gun case and put my hand on this gun, I had my eyes closed, but I could feel the tears streaming down my face. And I stood there for a minute. And what happened is we started to walk through some of the experience of what I was feeling. And then the next step was holding the gun. And when I got to that point, it just started to feel a little bit safer to me. Like I still had a lot of fear in my body. I was still very dysregulated, but I started to feel a little bit more comfortable knowing I was in that controlled environment. And then it got to a point where I put the gun back in the case, and then we both just sat and started to have a conversation about other things. And so that was a way for me to start processing the feeling that I was feeling in my body, and that was also giving it space to come back down to nearly a regulated state. So I would say we stayed in that environment for probably a half an hour after I was in that full intensity of fear, that state of mind. And for me, fear is all over my chest. I can feel it. It feels like physical pain. You know what fear feels like in your body when you feel unsafe. And so as we were having the conversation, my body just naturally started to regulate, because at this point I knew I was safe. I knew the gun wasn't going to go off. I knew everything that was going on. And then about an hour went by throughout this entire experience, and I was back into a state of regulation. That's where I decided to stop the exposure therapy for me, at least for that day, because I was like, okay, I think my body has had enough. I went through all of that. And if you don't have a fear of guns, and if you don't have a fear of balloons, like whatever, everybody has their own thing, right? But for me, that's always been a struggle for me. And to some people, it seems silly, but you know, when it's something you've lived with all your life and you really want to overcome that. I didn't want to go, this sounds so stupid, but I didn't want to go to birthday parties and have to explain, like, I'm sorry, but like, can you get your kid to stop touching that balloon? That sounds so bad. Or like, if somebody has a gun on display and they pick it up to start holding it, I didn't want to have to explain why I didn't want to be around the gun. Because like I said, it's not about the fact that it's a gun, it's a fact about the sound it makes. Or going to family events during the 4th of July or doing anything with my friends and then always having to wear earplugs or cover my ears or go inside when the fireworks are going off is just really, really disheartening for me, because I want to be involved in the experience. And I just have really sensitive hearing when it comes to that stuff, so much that it feels like sheer pain in my body. So for me, it was really important that I got over that fear, because I wanted to be in environments that other people just don't seem to have a problem with. But I will say I still have a fear of all that stuff. I didn't end up doing a second session of it, and maybe I will someday. But what I discovered afterward would completely change my mind about how I made decisions, because I didn't realize there were so many other times in my life where I was acting out of a state of fear because I didn't know what it felt like in my body. And I'll give you a couple examples. So shortly after that session, I had gotten a call about an opportunity that I think if I were in a less busy time of my life, I would have said yes to. But I also know, for me, when people I look up to or people that I admire ask me if I want to do something like a job opportunity or an opportunity in general or a painting or something, if I don't have the capacity for it, it really just feels like a load of pressure for me. And sometimes I just say yes out of obligation. But this opportunity arose, and I'm like sitting there, and suddenly I felt that feeling of fear. And I was like, wait a second, I just did fear exposure. My body is telling me something right now. I just don't think I ever made the actual connection of when somebody puts pressure on me to do something and I don't have the capacity to do it, or I don't want to, or I just don't have the time. I feel like I'm going to be like a disappointment if I say no, because I am a very performative person, and obviously we all have our things. And for me, it was like, if I'm not performing, sometimes I feel like a lack of worth, and that's just a self thing. And something that also I have learned to recognize, that I don't have to say yes to things because my worth is attached to it. I can just say no to things if my body is authentically telling me, hey, you don't have time for this. If you do this, you're going to put a lot of pressure on yourself, and then, whatever. And people aren't going to hate you if you say no to something. It was like that people-pleasing mentality. And then I just sat there with that feeling. I got off the phone, and I'm in this dysregulated state, and I'm like, I am in a state of fear right now. And if I say yes to this, which I probably would have had I not done the exposure therapy, then I would be reacting in a way to almost please somebody else other than acting out authentically and being like, hey, I just don't have time for this right now. And if I say yes to this, it's going to be me that has to deal with the repercussions of saying yes to something I just don't have time for. So I said no, and I felt just this, I sat back and I was like, wow, I didn't realize that was a state of fear for me. And it really opened my eyes to seeing that was a state of fear for me. And then it started to connect with other areas of my life when I would feel that common pressure on me. And then I was like, no, wait, I can say no to this. Or, I can say, hey, I need to delegate this to somebody else, instead of just taking on all the burden myself that I actually don't want to say yes to or don't have time to do. So that was really eye-opening to me and has been such a great benefit in my life. And then the other incident that happened was there was a person of a platonic relationship in an industry, and they were just losing their temper. And you know how some people they just let their words fly. They might not know the way that they're saying something is coming off in just a really aggressive tone. And so that was happening in this moment. And I'm standing in front of this person, and they're freaking out about this thing, and we're trying to make a decision about whatever. And I started to feel that sense of fear in my body. And normally, if somebody is raising their voice, I'm a fight person. I will fight back. I will definitely start putting my hand up, start mimicking them. I'll start being a mirror and reflecting their anger and start getting big and loud and angry. And I remember in that moment going, no. My body is in a state of fear right now, and it can't make a decision. I remember looking at that person, and I was like, hey. And I just said it. It just came out because I could feel that feeling welling up. And I was like, no, I need to stop myself right now from making some fight decisions. And I said, my body is really dysregulated right now. And I need to get in a calmer state. I can't think like this. Like, I'm not going to make a rational decision in this state of mind. And then I got myself out of the situation. I got myself out of the conversation, and I was able to regulate my body. And I was like, yeah, I don't have to stay in environments where I don't feel safe. I don't have to stay in conversations where my body is reacting out of a state of fear. So for me, exposure therapy really exposed what fear felt like in my body. And because I did exposure therapy and because I was in a state of fear for an extended period of time doing exposure therapy, I knew how to regulate my body back into a place of safety over here. And that has been life-changing for me, especially with my decisions. So maybe you're the kind of person who is a people pleaser, or you make decisions based off people putting pressure on you, or you are the kind of person who yells and fights, or maybe you're the person who disappears because your body is going into that dysregulated state and you're making decisions based on fears. I highly recommend trying exposure therapy because it changed my life. It changed my decisions. It changed how I wanted to be around people. And if people were always sending me into a state of fear, but I was reacting out of fear by either people pleasing, fawning, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Like fawn is often not talked about, but for me, when I sometimes go into a state of fear, whether it be with abandonment or rejection, I go into fawn and then I like cling to the thing, trying to show my worth, people pleasing. And it's like, dude, I don't want to be that way. I don't want to be that. I want to react authentic and I want to be around an environment that I feel safe in. And if my body's telling me that doesn't feel safe, then I got to go. There's so many decisions now that I make in a regulated state because I know what fear feels like in my body. Should you try exposure therapy? In all honesty, it was something for me that I think I was ready. I was at a point where I was ready in my life where I wanted to confront that fear because I'll tell you right now, I knew exactly what I was going into. I knew I was going to be in an intense state of fear, but I'll give you a few tips. If you are making the decision to try exposure therapy, do it with somebody who's trained in it. You have to be with somebody who's in control of that environment because you will be out of control, but you have to know there is a sense of safety in the other person with you, whether that be a trained professional or somebody who's trained in exposure therapy on its own. And just know that you're going to go through a variety of emotions as you're going through this, but get curious about it. Maybe get curious about like what fear feels like in your body, especially when it's at the heightened state. So for me, it's like when I felt the intense fear, but I had to sit there, it came out in tears. It came out in like my body shaking a little bit, but it was an opportunity for me to kind of welcome that feeling and then let it go. And that was something that helped me go from a state of dysregulation to a state of regulation, even though I had one of my biggest fears sitting in front of me. So I got curious about it. And then just be aware that you may experience that state of fear in other areas of your life that maybe you didn't recognize before. And then you can act accordingly, get yourself into a regulated state, into a state of safety, and make a better decision. I really hope you enjoyed hearing about my experience with exposure therapy. Until next time, bye.